any sensation that we are not consciously aware of cannot be pleasure. Preserve our sense of self, and if you had the knowledge of how rare it is to feel bliss, does this really take away meaning from our lives, or does it add meaning? I just find it a conversation that we need to be having. If you clicked on this video, it's probably because you're interested in technology and its role in our world. You've come to the right place, because that is what I will be talking about. Hey guys, I'm S.1E.1, and this is a very special video because it is the first in a series where I will be employing philosophical techniques to make the discussion of our evolving responsibilities in the digital world more approachable and respectable and existent. Let's just take this here because it is my script. Aki. I personally believe that we have the right as humans to live our most authentic lives, whatever that means to you. Which is why I have been so drawn to this conversation of how digital media, mainly social media, but also including the internet in general, has been impacting our sense of self and meaning in our lives. I also want to be able to create a space for people to talk about this issue in a constructive way and eventually create solutions on a personal and maybe someday even local or global scale. Another one of my goals is to spark excitement of how to reignite our society's passion for talking about this, because it is an exciting concept. And I think that gets lost in a world where the issue is so complexified and it's kind of just dumbed down to saying, oh yeah, like phones, there are definitely some pros and cons. Yeah. Cue end of conversation. Especially for the young generation, it is our duty, I feel, to remember these times and make sure that the future is the best it can be, or at least continuing to stay conscious and active in our world. Because God knows, effective dialogue where pride, ego, and reputation aren't on the line is much needed today. You may be wondering what my credentials are, and I would too. I am taking an intro to philosophy course this semester, and I am actually debating whether to add a minor in philosophy to my double major. And even though it is just an intro to philosophy course, I feel as though I'm finally learning a language to how my mind works, and it feels amazing. One thing I want to keep in mind during this journey is to keep it accessible, to really distill the technique used and teachings and thoughts of philosophers to be useful to a mass of people who don't have knowledge in what philosophy is. Because I find it really helpful, and it definitely keeps the conversation aligned and focused, and that is also, I feel, what is needed today in today's society, because certain conversations get so out of focus that you forget exactly what you're discussing. So it is a way to focus the conversation and to direct it in a way that serves the purpose of why you're having a conversation. One thing we learned in class is that Aristotle believed that philosophy was an activity, a verb that someone engaged in. So it's not just rote memorizing the ideas of ancient Greek philosophers and calling it a day. It's really using philosophy as a technique and a way to go about your life. I want to enact that here. Of course, getting distracted. I need to silence this. This is so ironic because I'm talking about technology and getting pings with my computer. Okay, whew. I want to enact that here on this channel. And so if you have any questions, comments, or contributions, please feel free to type below in the comments below and start a little discussion with me, yourself, or even other people in the comment section. There will be a final prompt at the end of the video based on what was discussed in the video, or you can just say whatever you thought was interesting in the video. Not me giving you permission to say what you want. You know what? I do anyways. You have permission. In this video, we will be discussing the first chapter of Eva Hoffman's book, How to Be Bored, published in 2016. In this video, we will discuss discuss Hoffman and the issue of hedonism, the 7 different types of hedonism and their connection to Hoffman's argument, Socrates' oyster example in relation to the technology debate, and closing remarks and discussion prompts. It is now time for my origin story. When I was in middle school, I read a book called How to Be Bored by Eva Hoffman, and this is a book. In a world of technology-induced stimulation, I say Eva because Eva Noblezada, if you know Hadestown, or you know, the actress. Eva enacts examples from philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and literature to present how one can preserve our sense of self and our depth in our lives through focused reflection. She believes that to be very important, and that's what she argues primarily in this book. At the time I read this in middle school, phones were becoming very popular, not truly to the extent they are today, you know, with banking and email being so prevalent on our phones. And I was beginning to get curious about their impact on our lives and how things might have been different in the past without technology. Probably influenced by this book, I did adopt a very kind of surface level view of them. I knew they were bad in some ways, and that they did cause us not to be fully present in our everyday lives. But at the same time, I did have a great childhood that was enhanced creatively by digital media, such as bonding with friends and making musicallys with them. Crap ton of musicallys. And despite the fact that I had definitely grown up on digital media and YouTube, I never really saw it as like a huge prevalent issue until I read this book. And it successively made me more curious about the psychological and cultural implications that this rapid speed of life has on our relationships and therefore others. The potential for rapidization, because I know a lot of people, some people's lives, they don't feel are rapid. So for the purpose of this conversation, we will just focus on the capability of rapidity in our society. Okay, without further ado, because that was a long intro, let's hop into today's passage that I will be discussing. Discussing, apparently, not discussing. Oh my god. So within the first chapter, called Hyperactivity and its Discontents, she paints our world as one of constant available stimulation in opposition to the past, when one had more opportunity to be bored. Instead of being constantly on, even in their home lives, after they get home from work. In her argument, she draws in consumerism as well, arguing that since we have anything we want at our fingertips, we thus feel even more frazzled and always connected. She discusses as well the negative impacts of constant information consumption. Considering that, this is so interesting to me. The brain uses extra energy in switching from one task to another, and eventually it slows down and goes into a kind of gridlock. In the long term, the fragmentation of attention, a breaking up of focus and mental continuity, can disrupt neural connections in the brain and eventually lead to a literally shallower neurological structure. It makes us, on the physiological level of the brain, as well as one of the mind, less capable of concentration and continuous thought. And in addition, because we are less comfortable with being alone with our thoughts, she argues that the search for gratification has become addictive and provides us with what she calls a hedonic pleasure. Now, hedonism, after researching this, in the philosophical sense, has been widely debated by ancient Greek philosophers. Eva includes that the seminal philosophers of ancient Greece, Epicurus, Socrates, Aristotle, thought of their endeavor not as an abstract process of reasoning, but as a therapy of the soul, and whatever their disagreements, they were being unanimous on certain basic pleasures of well-being. Momentary pleasures of hedonism are distinct from deeper and more lasting satisfaction, and in order to achieve such satisfaction, we need to reflect on who we are and what our lives are for. We cannot be fully human without thinking about what being human means. Now let's unpack that. Here, Eva makes the claim that in order to fully live as humans are meant to live, and to live their happiest lives, we must be able to reflect and therefore disregard momentary bliss. One aspect of this argument I want to delve deeper into, however, is the idea of hedonism and the many different meanings that it has in philosophy, in order to further grasp and understand the nuance embedded within Hoffman's argument. According to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, hedonism as a philosophical concept goes much farther than the simple definition found on Google, as the ethical theory that pleasure, in the sense of the satisfaction of desires, is the highest good and proper aim of human life. For one, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on hedonism describes that what makes hedonism as a concept so popular is its stark discussion of pleasure and pain as the only elements that are important in the discussion of whatever event or circumstance is being described. In addition, philosophical hedonists tend to focus on hedonistic theories of value and especially of well-being, the good life for the one living. Another important distinction is that pleasure and pain are defined generally, including both physical and mental experiences. Already here we see a narrowing of what the term hedonism applies to, further adding nuance to Eva's employment of this in the argument that we should question in order to live meaningful lives. Does this stay true across all 7 different types of hedonism? Let us see. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy lays out 7 major different types of hedonism, and they are as follows. Number 1, folk hedonism, when one seeks personal pleasure without thinking of the future implications for their well-being. Now, this is the classic kind of hedonism we are most familiar with, the stereotypical one you just hear on the street, and you hear it in songs, media. This is just the stereotypical kind of hedonism. 2, value hedonism. All and only pleasure is intrinsically valuable, and all and only pain is intrinsically disvaluable. Intrinsically meaning for its own sake. This is different from something having instrumental value. The example given that money has instrumental value because you can do something with it. Number 3, prudential hedonism. Slightly more narrowed down than value hedonism, it defines the purpose of the value. It states that all and only pleasure intrinsically makes people's lives go better for them, and all and only pain intrinsically makes their lives go worse for them. And it highlights that avoiding pain in the short term is not always the best strategy for achieving the best long-term balance of pleasure over pain. This is something about prudential hedonism that I will get back to later in this video. This is a delicious little thing to go into in terms of digital media's impact on our relationship with ourselves and pleasure and pain. Number 4, motivational hedonism, or also called psychological hedonism. We act out of a desire to encounter pleasure and to avoid pain, and this drives our behavior. They note that strong accounts of motivational hedonism are not very popular, as most argue that there are many other reasons that one may seek pleasure and avoid pain, and that is not a good description of why we act the way we do. Normative hedonism and ethical hedonism. Pleasure should be pursued and pain should be avoided. Number 6, hedonistic egoism. We ought, morally speaking, to do whatever makes us happiest, whatever provides us with the most net pleasure after pain is subtracted. Now, this is very, very unpopular because it entails that one would need to reprogram their morals to not feel guilty for theft, murder, and the like, such as stealing candy from a child. It, in this sense, would give you pleasure. Utilitarianism, which is the right action is the one that produces, or is most likely to produce, the greatest net happiness for all concerned. And in this example, stealing candy from a child is wrong because the child is now sad. After going over all of these different types of hedonism, I believe it is useful to question and really delve into what the purpose of self-reflection in a hyperactive world really means to Eva. In the first passage, she mentions that the fact that generally the collective we are less comfortable with silence, which would in the hedonic sense equate to pain, and in order to get rid of that pain, the pain of not being comfortable, being alone with your thoughts, we seek pleasure in the form of scrolling, consumption, and the like. All of these classical hedonic distinctions connect relatively easily to the issue, as it highlights the pleasure of consumption and activity with no regard for how we will feel in the long term, which may be negatively. However, one distinction definitely makes the nuance more complicated, as prudential hedonism highlights that one cannot be sure that short-term pleasure seeking will always guarantee long-term pleasure, paradoxically countering folk hedonism. In this sense, it would mean that it is not hedonic in the traditional folk sense, as you are seeking pleasure, but in the prudential hedonic sense, abstaining from scrolling would truly be hedonistic, since, as Hoffman argues, people wind up feeling worse off after unintentionally scrolling for a while. In addition, I find motivational/psychological hedonism very applicable to this issue, as it seemingly takes some of the blame off of you and places it on some inner, more innate survival instinct to avoid pain, because we are looking to avoid, because prudential hedonism essentially leaves room for the fact that maybe what you're doing now in the short term won't benefit you in the long term, so it doesn't really make sense to do something pleasurable now that might bring pain in the future. And that little nuance there is an important type of distinction, I believe. So you can't just say, so within philosophy, these have been debated and supported and rejected by philosophers over time, but that's the beauty of philosophy. These different ways of describing hedonism allow us to narrow down the focus of this argument. And because obviously if you go up to someone and say you're scrolling on your phone, what is that going to do for finding really the root cause of the issue and discussing how it impacts us? And I think that adds a little level of complexity. Obviously in the first chapter of her book, she's definitely talking about folk hedonism in the sense that with disregarding these little nuances, I just thought it would be interesting to see the perspective that these 7 different types would have in relation to the digital issue. And after going over all of these different types of hedonism, I believe it is useful to question and really delve into what is the purpose of that reflection that Hoffman brings up. It definitely highlights her point that reevaluating what will truly make us happy and fight against the things that are grasping for our attention in order to achieve a state of more potent happiness or satisfaction now and in the future. Because with prudential hedonism, it does have that vision of even though it will cause us some pleasure now, will it really in the future? Motivational hedonism, our brains are instinctively designed to divert us from what feels uncomfortable as a survival instinct, divert us from what makes us feel fear or a sense of discomfort. We want to be comfortable as humans, so if we are taken away from something that we believe will be comfortable for us, then we want to go back to it. So that really bolsters Eva's argument that we need that time, and that is truly the purpose of that focused reflection, to reconnect with ourselves. And even if we convince ourselves that we have it under control and that everything's just okay, is there a possible life you could be living that is more meaningful if you took the time to really reflect? And by exposing ourselves to that discomfort, combating that more hedonic desire, all 7 different types, can we learn things about ourselves and therefore live better lives? Because why is that book not there? Let's put it there. Because that's the point of life, I believe. Given your circumstance, just live the happiest life. And that's also an interesting thing, because the tying of happiness and pleasure is also widely debated within the philosophical field. I believe Socrates explored that a lot. And I looked in one of his more controversial works, actually. It's called Protagoras, and in this, Socrates kind of goes along the lines of, for the sake of furthering his argument, of even endorsing hedonism, but that's a whole separate thing, because he later reaffirmed differing opinions in his work, The Republic. But that just goes to show how one term can't really just be thrown as an example, especially the term hedon, because it's so charged, you know? And I feel like having those charged words, especially in a book such as this, would cause someone to shy away and be like, ugh, I don't need to do focused reflection because I already live a life that I'm comfortable with. So maybe if we change the discussion, we change the argument of calling people hedons for enjoying the pleasures of scrolling, because obviously, not to go off on a tangent, we all know that there are pros. As I said before, we all know that there are pros and cons with social media. You can connect with your friends, stay connected to friends you met like freaking forever ago. And my only goal is to use this to come up with some way where we can make progress with this conversation. Especially in a world where it's so politicized now, with phones being banned in schools. Like, that just scares me, because once anything becomes politicized, though, being able to discuss it in a intellectual way becomes harder. Well, that's just today's society. Let me know if you do agree or disagree with that, and if you see that in your own life as well. The polarization of today makes it really hard to have just basic discussions without getting on people's nerves. It's really scary. Just basic discussion. Like, pride and ego inhibit insanely the amount of progress that could be made if we put those to the side and just focused on objective solutions. That's a utopian society, I know, but wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be great? It'd be so great. In other words, before we close out this first episode, I would like to finish this by discussing the oyster example. And I believe it to be curiously pertinent. I wrote that here, curiously pertinent. In its application to this issue, which is brought up in Socrates' dialogue with Protarchus, and discussing pleasure's role in living the good life. Don't we all want to live the good life? Within this dialogue, Socrates states, Philebus was saying, Philebus is a character that, if you don't know, Plato was the one to write down Socrates' dialogues with other people, because Socrates did see it as an activity. He didn't see it as something to be written down. So thanks, Plato, for recording all that, because we would have lost a lot. Although people in English classrooms who have ever done a Socratic seminar would probably want to murder Plato for making that a thing. How would Socrates sound? Let's see. Philebus was saying that enjoyment and pleasure and delight, and the class of feeling akin to them, are a good to every living being, whereas I contend that not these, but wisdom and intelligence and memory, and their kindred, right opinion and true reasoning, are better and more desirable than pleasure for all who are able to partake of them, and that to all such who are or ever will be, they are the most advantageous of all things. Have I not given, Philebus, a fair statement of the two sides of the argument? And then Protarchus responds, nothing could be fairer, Socrates. And they start making out. No, I'm kidding. So, here, within Protarchus, Socrates tells him to imagine two scenarios. 1, imagine a life of pleasure without mental aptitude. 2, imagine a life of mental aptitude but no pleasure, by saying, and similarly, if you had no memory, you would not recollect that you had ever been pleased, nor would the slightest recollection of the pleasure which you feel at any moment remain with you, and if you had no true opinion, you would not think that you were pleased when you were. Bro's going off here. And if you had no power of calculation, you would not be able to calculate on future pleasure, and your life would be the life not of a man, but of an oyster. Could this be otherwise? And he says no. So the way that Socrates gets Protarchus to halt his hedonistic ways is because Protarchus simply can't imagine a life of pleasure while living like an unthinking oyster. And thus Socrates wins the argument. Now, wouldn't one bring up that one can consciously experience pleasure in addition to having the basic mental capabilities and knowledge, like, you know, the general average person in today's society can have pleasure and pain, because that's just a thing that people have, which is not applicable to philosophical conversation because it is for the sole purpose of defining terms in order to reap more benefit out of the conversation. Just as a reminder that philosophy is sometimes really weird because it's not how we normally think. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like it or have had bad experiences with it, because it is so not, it feels like you're getting nowhere, but in reality you are getting further than you would, in my opinion. Because you spend so long defining terms and be like, oh, well, that only applies when this, or that only applies when that. And if you just like cut the BS and like define those bad boys, then you can actually have a good, knowledgeable conversation. It's about eliminating bad answers. Smart stuff. Can you tell why I like this class? It is fun. Again, it's like how my brain works. Anyways, to close this out, we need to close this video out. Let's do it. Let's bring us home. You would be correct in bringing that up 5 minutes ago. The fact that you can have pleasure and pain, because as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is called the IEP, states that the oyster example is now easily avoided by clarifying that pleasure is best understood as being a conscious experience. Get this, it says, so any sensation that we are not consciously aware of cannot be pleasure. Well, ain't that the jackpot in this discussion of digital media and ourselves? That is too good. I say that because isn't that the core of what we are discussing here? The fact that we seem today to not be comfortable with being consciously aware, of fully sitting and reflecting with our feelings and emotions. And according to her, since the fragmentation of our attention is literally changing our brain structure to not be wired to be able to stay in a state of continuous thought, how does that connect to this idea that because we are not consciously aware, can it still be called pleasure? And further, can it still be called hedonism? And therefore, the argument that Epicurus, Socrates, and Aristotle denounced that, does that still hold argumentative weight? Dun dun dun. To me, Socrates' question definitely ties into the whole is ignorance truly bliss thing in a sense, except in this oyster example, he is asking if one is ignorant, can they have the ability to enjoy that bliss? Do they have the smarts to be able to fully understand that they are in a state of bliss? And how deep does that bliss go? Could the bliss be felt deeper if you had the knowledge of how rare it is to feel bliss in the modern world? These are the questions, man. These are the questions. And does hedonism, the search for what makes us feel good, truly disrupt our ability to be conscious in our lives? Or are we right in enjoying our physical and mental pleasures while knowing that they might be bad for us in the long term? Is it right or is it wrong? And again, I'm an intro to philosophy student, so that is my take and my knowing what I know of philosophy, distilling and applying what I know of philosophy to these different readings that I picked out, Eva Hoffman's, as well as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and their definitions of hedonism. That is what I have thought and reflected on. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts with anything I have said in this video, and specifically the discussion prompts? Let's do this thing. Oh, I'm such a YouTuber, guys. I'm such a YouTuber. Anyways, okay. So, the discussion questions. Number 1, which type of hedonism do you find most curious in the application to the issue of staying true to our most authentic lives in the digital world? And number 2, do you believe that pleasure felt unconsciously could still be considered pleasurable? For me, it's just a matter of you're never alone, because there's a TV right here, there's a camera right here connecting me to God knows who, laptop right in front of me connecting me to anything I want, my phone connecting me to all of my friends I've ever met in my life, and teachers and freaking there's just so much connection. And does that take away? Do we need more time for focused reflection to stay true to what really matters? Does this really take away meaning from our lives, or does it add meaning? And I guess it is in terms of what you truly value, because for me, I do value what is called now like your peace. And I know it's also controversial with like protecting your peace. Like, are people protecting their peace too much? I know I've seen headlines of YouTube videos like that, but I just find it a conversation that we need to be having in a way that the conversation is not being had. So I'd like to create that here. Yeah. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the first episode of this series where I will be applying philosophical techniques to make the discussion of our evolving responsibilities in the digital world more approachable and respectable. The rest of the videos in this series will probably be around 5 to 7 minutes. I underestimated the amount of time this would take. But yeah, thank you! See you in the comment section. Make sure to like this video and only subscribe if you will watch more of my videos, because it messes with the algorithm. Peace out.